What's up, guys? It's LJ here, Lawrence James coming at you from Lawrence James Hearthstone. And today I will be doing a review of all the 30 Naxx cards that got released. That includes the class cards and each class for each wing. I'm going to be rating these cards from a 1 to 10 value system on their quality. When I'm thinking about the quality of the card, I'm including how often it is played, the potential use of the card, and how reliant that card is on others to be effective. In week 1 so far, we have seen, first one is Haunted Creeper, which is a 2-mana 1/2 with the Deathrattle of Summon 2, 1/1 Spectral Spiders. I think this card is actually very comparable to Harvest Golem. It's really nice to have that in the 2-mana slot instead of the 3, so it doesn't necessarily compete with the Harvest Golem. It's a very durable minion. It's something that's going to require a little bit of thought to your opponent of how am I going to remove this minion. I still think you will mostly see this card played in zoo decks where you can get value out of summoning another 1/1 creature such as Dark Iron Dwarf or Defender of Argus. But I think you still might see this played in control decks that lack that 2 slot. Perhaps in Token Druid, where you can get value out of 2/1/1s with Power of the Wild, or mid-range decks or control decks that really lack a 2-drop that's very solid. I think Harvest Golem is very popular in the 3 slot with control decks, and I think you could see a very similar thing in the 2 slot. The next card that we're looking at is Narubar Weblord, which is a 2-mana 1/4, and it has an effect of minions with battle cries cost 2 more. I think you're going to see this card possibly in Control Paladin or Control Druid. It's decent for mid-range decks that don't have a 2-slot card. It basically stalls the game. That's what this card is meant to do. I think the problem with this card is that it's very dependent on what the meta is played. If you're seeing a lot of zoo, a lot of aggro decks, then there's a very good chance that this card will be played a lot. But the problem is when you start facing control decks and mid-range decks in particular that run things like Yeti and other things that don't have battle cries necessarily, the card is pretty iffy at best, and it'll probably take up a slot that you don't want to take up. The next one that we're looking at is Nerubian Egg, which is a 2-mana 0/2, and the Deathrattle is summon a 4/4. I think it's a card that's a little overrated right now. People are saying this is the best card in Naxx, and I cannot disagree more so. Don't get me wrong, I think this card is great in aggro decks or zoo decks where you can utilize the minion and buff it up and then eventually trade. The problem with the 0/2 is it's so inefficient in almost every other deck that can't get value out of the 0/2. If you can't buff up the 0/2 without expanding too many resources, because if you're using like Blessing of Cains or Mark of the Wild, yeah, that is getting use out of the egg. You're going to be able to kill off your egg eventually. But the problem with that is you're using a huge resource. In zoo, you can use things like Abusive Sergeant, even maybe a Defender of Argus or a Dark Iron Dwarf or a Shattered Sunclake. There's a lot of ways to buff it up without overextending, which is what you'd have to do with this card with other decks. So it's very reliant on synergy. That's a reason why I don't think you're going to see it played in Arena, because unless you have a lot of buffs, then the Nerubian Egg is going to be a bad card to play on turn 2. The next card that we're looking at is Mexina, which is a 6-mana 2/8, and its effect is destroy any minion damaged by this minion. It is a beast, so you may see this card played in future Control Hunter decks. The problem with this card that I see, it has very low attack for a 6-drop. It's weak to Kodo, doesn't have a taunt, so that means that your opponents can choose to attack around it. And 8 health does not really make it that durable for a 6-drop. It's just a little too slow for my liking. I think it's a card that looks to have a lot of potential, but its stats really kill this card. If it was something like a 4/6, this card would be unreal, but the fact that they hurt the stats so much makes this card pretty unplayable in my opinion. There's just a lot of different options in the 6 slot that's going to be more important to have. In week 2 of Naxxramas, we are going to see Stone Skin Gargoyle, which is a 3-mana 1/4. At the start of your turn, restore this minion to full health. I think this card can be played in a wide variety of decks. It can be played in control matchups. It can be played in mid-range decks. It can be played in aggro decks or zoo decks as well. But I think mainly you're going to see this card played in Druid or Paladin control decks. Basically, you have to have the opportunity to buff this up with quite a big buff to get this minion to its maximum potential. Mark of Nature, Blessing of Cains, Mark of the Wild. What I'm saying is this card is very reliant on getting value out of its effect, so you need to be able to buff this thing up. The next card we're looking at is Unstable Ghoul, which is a 2-mana 1/3. Its effect is it's a taunter, and its Deathrattle is deal 1 damage to all minions. I think this card is being severely underrated. People are saying it's not very good, and I completely disagree with that. I think finally Blizzard has found a way to make a low-cost minion with bad stats. The 1/3 is very bad, but it's a very good card. Amazing effect that does a lot of what you want your 2-drops to do, and even more so in synergetic decks. This card will still trade with 3/2 minions, which is really key for Arena. In Constructed, we're going to see this card played a lot in Control Warrior decks, for example, getting use out of the Deathrattle effect to all minions. I think this is going to be one of the best techs to throw in versus Zoo and aggro decks, because dealing 1 damage is really nice against those aggro decks, especially against Paladin aggro. After people get used to the cards, this card's going to be played a lot, in my opinion. Sludge Belcher is the next one that we're looking at, which is a 5-mana 3/5. Its effect is a taunt, and Deathrattle summon a 1/2 slime with taunt. This is another card that's overall goal is made to counter Zoo and aggro. It has okay stats. The Deathrattle summons a Goldshire Footman, which can be quite useful. It just basically stalls the game, and it's a really nice 5-drop. I really like this card a lot. I think you're going to see this card in late game control decks, such as controlled late game Ramp Druid or Control Warrior, basically where they want to get into their late game, into the Ragnaroses, into the Gromishes, into the Ysseras. I think you're going to see this card played a lot in those decks because it's a very good staller. It's going to save you quite a bit of damage. I think the 5-mana slot really needed a lot of help, and Naxxramas is really doing a good job at that. And this is the first card that we've seen in the 5 slot that's a very good alternative to slowing your opponent down, an alternative to something like Azure Drake, where people have just basically thrown that card in because they need a good 5-slot card. Well, in Naxxramas, there's a lot of 5 slots, and we'll see that as we go out through the rest of the cards. But this is the first one that I think is a great choice in the 5 slot. The next card that we're looking at, the legendary, is the 5-mana Loatheb. It's a 5/5, and its battle cry is enemy spells cost 5 more next turn. This is probably, in my opinion, the best card released in Naxxramas. I think this card is going to be used in almost every single deck. It has the potential to be played in Control, even aggro, and many more decks. A lot of people didn't consider that it could be playable in aggro, but imagine throwing this out after you already have a board and now your opponent can't swipe or they can't wrath your minions down. That's quite powerful. It has the perfect stats as well for a 5-drop. 5/5, exactly what we're looking for in the stat category. It's also amazing versus control decks, which rely heavily on using those spells to get rid of your minions. So you can throw this in your control deck, throw out a beautiful Yeti, and on the following turn throw this out there. Now suddenly they can't remove your minions at all, and they're relying on having board control to remove your minion, which is going to be amazing for this card. This card will absolutely kill control decks, decks that rely on spells to remove minions, and also decks that rely on card drawing in the mid game. It stops combo decks like Miracle Rogue and Force of Nature Savage Roar combos. This card is just amazing, and I literally cannot wait to get a hold of it because I just think it's going to be, like, you have to play this card. This card is going to be the new meta for sure. In week 3, we're going to see Dancing Swords, which is a 3-mana 4/4. Deathrattle, your opponent draws a card. So first thing we notice is it has amazing stats, right? A 4/4 for 3 mana is absolutely amazing. This card will be played in Zoo decks, perhaps in aggro decks as well, such as maybe Paladin aggro. That way you can get more draws out of your Divine Favor. The DR can be really bad, though, depending on what type of deck you're playing. If you're not playing aggro, or you're not playing some type of rush deck, then generally this card is not going to be good. You're not going to see this card in control decks. You may see it in Arena because tempo is so important in Arena that you may actually see this card quite valued. Although giving your opponent a card is not something I would suggest is that great. The next one we're looking at is Spectral Knights, which I must say I love. It's a 5-mana 4/6, can't be targeted by spells or hero power, so it's basically a Fairy Dragon. It's Fairy Dragon's older brother, basically. I absolutely love this card. It has amazing stats for a 5-drop and an unreal effect for the 5 slots that I think was absolutely needed. I love cards that are based around having board control and forcing your opponent to interact with minions. I think that's something that's been missing in the latest construction versions. A lot of board controlling and trading with minions has completely disappeared in Hearthstone, and I think this is a card that really is going to bring that kind of style back into the game. Not being able to remove this thing with a Siphon Soul, a Soulfire, a Swipe, a Wrath, a Hammer of Wrath, Shield Slam makes this card absolutely amazing. This card will be played in mid-range, control, and all Arena decks. I really think this card, it hit the nail on the head. I love this card. The next one we're looking at is Deathlord, which is a 3-mana 2/8. Its effect is Taunt, Deathrattle. Your opponent puts a minion from their deck into the battlefield. This card is going to have some major drawbacks that causes people not to run it or be very wary of running it. The stats are obviously great versus aggro, and maybe even against aggro, bringing out a minion from their deck may not even be that bad. It may be somewhat bad, but you're going to get value out of the 2/8. The issue with this card is what happens when you play a control deck and they kill this thing on a couple turns. Then what happens when they bring out a Naxxramas or a Ysera or something just that will completely win them the game. And that's why I think you're not going to see this card played much at all. If you're facing a ton of Zoo and a ton of aggro decks, yeah, throw this thing in. But even then, you're risking the chance that you are going to run into that control deck, and then this card may be unplayable in your hand. I think the card is just too risky, frankly. The legendary in this wing will be Baron Rivendare, which is a 4-mana, 1/7. Your minions trigger their Deathrattles twice. I think it goes without saying that this card is 100% reliant on having a Deathrattle-focused deck. You won't see this card in anything outside of that Deathrattle deck. Just because the stats on this card are not good, it's really bad for a 4-drop, not something that you want to be playing on turn 4. It's something you want to be playing as almost a finisher when you already have board control. And you can throw this out there when you're about to trade in some of your minions. So I think it'll be more of a zoo-based Deathrattle deck is where you're going to see this card played. But besides that, I just don't see this card getting much play time, unfortunately. In week 4, we will see the Undertaker, which is a 1-mana 1/2. Its effect is whenever you summon a minion with Deathrattle, gain +1/+1. Like Baron Geddon, this card is very reliant on having a deck with Deathrattles in it. A little less so because you can get value out of this card early in the game with things like Loot Hoarder and Harvest Golem, which are already played cards. So you may see this card played way more than the Baron Rivendare. It's less expensive too. Still, though, it is reliant on having the right deck, which is going to hold this card back from being played. The next card that we're looking at is Mad Scientist, which is a 2-mana 2/2. Deathrattle, put a secret from your deck into the battlefield. That means they will be played. This effect is amazing and will completely change people's outlook on secret decks. Mage secrets, paladin secrets, these will all be played and they will be very, very viable decks. This card is super mana efficient, is amazing for tempo. Being able to take a card from your deck and play it on turn 2. That is the definition of tempo and value. You're going to see a lot of secret decks come out that are very viable and legend worthy for sure. The next one we're looking at is Zombie Chow, which is a 1-mana 2/3 with the Deathrattle of restore 5 health to the enemy hero. This is another card that I think is being extremely undervalued, or maybe just a little bit undervalued. A lot of people are thinking that this card is probably just going to be played in control decks, if that, or more than likely arena. I think it's good in control. I think it's good in aggro as well. It's the best 1-drop stat in the game for sure. I mean, having a 2/3 for 1 mana, that's amazing. I mean, it's not as good as Flame Imp, but it's pretty darn close, and every class can run it now. The effect does not really matter in most decks. Aggro is the only one you can really make a case for, and that's a really extreme aggro, like Face Hunter or Leopard Gnome Warlock. Because if you're playing things like Druid or Paladin, throwing this minion out there, you just want it to be able to trade with minions and get you early board presence. You're not really worried about restoring the health because this card is not going to be your win condition. So restoring 5 health, it may not even restore any health to them at all. They may be at 30 health. And in aggro, this card may even do more than the 5 damage to your opponent's face because they may have trouble removing this. Imagine if it baits out things like Wrath and Swipe, which is exactly what it's going to bait out. That's what this card is going to do. So now your things come in like Knife Juggler and Harvest Golem, and they've used their removal on this 1-mana minion, which is a 2/3, which I'm telling you guys, I think this card is going to be really good. The next card that we're looking at is Wailing Soul, which is a 4-mana 3/5 with a battle cry of Silence Your Other Minions. It's a pretty interesting card, and I really had to think about this card of like, how is this card meant to be played, and how are we going to get value out of this card in the current state of the game? So obviously this card has amazing synergy with Ancient Watcher. That's the first thing you think of when you think of silencing a minion. That's 4/5 for 2 mana, and you can silence it on turn 4. You can have a Yeti and a Violet Teacher stat on the board. That's quite strong, I'm not going to lie. It also has effect with minions that have been debuffed either by Elder Peacekeeper or Humility or something like that. I still don't get why you can't debuff a sheep. Also, it helps with things like Equality. If you Equality your opponent's board, and then you have a huge board yourself, you play the silence minion, silence your own minions, and voila, they actually heal back up to full. So that's quite nice too. So will this card be played? I'm actually not so sure it will be played. I think it's a very specific deck, and there's just not enough combos in the game to justify running this card, at least at 2. You may be able to run it at 1, and may have some success with it. I'm not sure. The stats are fine with it, but the silencing your own minions kind of could be a little bad. I think if it was a 3-mana, like 3/4, and it had this effect, it would see a lot more playing time. But the fact it is a 4 mana, there's so many good 4 mana minions such as Yeti and Senjin, Violet Teacher, Twilight Drake that will take the priority over this card. The next 3 cards we're going to be talking about is very dependent on each other, so I'm going to explain these cards a little different. Feugen, which is a 5 mana legendary. It has 4/7 for stats. Its Deathrattle is, if Stalagg also die this game, summon Thaddeus. Stalagg, on the other hand, is a 5 mana 7/4 with the Deathrattle. If Feugen also die this game, summon Thaddeus. Thaddeus is an 11/11 vanilla card. So in my opinion, Stalagg is much worse than Feugen by far. Stalagg is very weak with that 4 health. I mean, unfortunately, even though it has more attack, it's making it weak to things like Big Game Hunter too. But it now is also susceptible to things like 2 drops and 3 drops and definitely 4 drops and Frost Bolts and Flame Strikes, and generally you guys get the idea. 4 health is really not good for the 5 mana slot. Feugen, on the other hand, I think he's a great card. I think that's amazing stats. It's able to deal with those early game threats, and it has enough health to keep it durable, which is really what we're seeing with tempo decks and mid-range decks. That's very important, is to have a card that can stay in the field for a long time. So when both of these cards die, Thaddeus will be summoned. There's a lot of interesting things to consider here, such as the mirror match. It's going to be very swingy, and it's going to be very strange. What I mean by that is if you kill your opponent's Feugen somehow, and then you summon Stalagg, all you have to do is wait for your Stalagg to die, and then you can summon the Thaddeus. So it plays off of your opponent's minion as well, which is going to be very weird, and of course that's vice versa. Thaddeus is a pretty strong minion, and the idea behind him is that you basically summon him after your opponent has used their removal on lesser minions. This guy comes out there and does the damage and finishes the game. Will that happen? I'm not so sure. There's a lot of removal in the game right now, and Thaddeus doesn't have any effect, and so he may not be that great, but the combo is there, and the combo is very sufficient. I think this deck is going to be amazing. I think it's awesome that Blizzard is trying to make these specific cards for specific style decks, and I think that's something they should definitely do in the future with more expansions. I would definitely check out running this deck if I were you guys, and think about other synergetic cards in Hearthstone that would work really well with this deck, because I really think A, it's going to be really fun, and B, it's going to be a very viable deck. In Week 5, we will see Echoing Ooze, which is a 2 mana 1/2 with a battle cry of summon an exact copy of this minion at the end of the turn. Now, it only summons 1 minion. It is a battle cry, so it only comes out once. So basically, for 2 mana, you're getting 2 1/2 minions. In my opinion, this card is kind of similar to Haunted Creeper in the sense that you're throwing out a minion that's very durable, and it's going to be hard for your opponent to remove it. But that said, I think Haunting Creeper is a far superior card. I don't think that people are going to run both of those cards in the deck. I think it's a little too slow. So I think you're going to see Haunted Creeper generally taken over this Ooze card. I still think it's a pretty viable card, though, and you may see it in things like Zoo or Aggro Rush, where you can get value out of extra minions. Maybe even Token Druid, too, actually. Don't put that out of the question. I just think the card would be a lot better if Haunted Creeper wasn't a card. The next card we're looking at is Shade of Naxxramas, which is a 3 mana 2/2. It has Stealth, and at the start of your turn, you gain +1/+1. In my mind, it's kind of a more playable version of a mix of in my opinion, it's a more playable questing adventurer and girl combination. I think this card is going to be a really high pick in Arena. It's very versatile. You can trade in other minions. A lot of times they don't have removal to finish off your minion. So anytime you can get really valuable trades, that is the definition of Arena efficiency and Arena success. I think this card will be very good in Constructed as well. You're going to see this in a lot of combo decks. You can throw this minion out there, let it charge up, either build your board up more, remove their minion with spells, and just let this guy go to work, and eventually you can win the game off of him. The problem with the card is that it is a little slow, and it does take a little bit of time to build it up, and it is weak to things, obviously. Eventually, at one point, it's so strong that it can be removed by anything. This card may be played more in control decks where you can just keep hitting with it, and it keeps healing itself back up and kind of use the card like that. But I think you could see this card in any type of deck. You can see it in aggro, you can see it in control, so you're going to see this card in everything, in my opinion, and certainly in Arena. Kel'Thuzad is the legendary card in this week, and it is a 8 mana 6/6. It has an effect of, at the end of each turn, summon all friendly minions that die this turn. I think this is, again, a card that's going to play a similar role to Ysera. It's basically meant to end the game as fast as possible after you already have a lead. If you don't already have minions on the field, you're not going to want to play Kel'Thuzad. An 8 mana 6/6 that has no effect, it's just a vanilla, that's not very good. This card will shine in Deathrattle decks, which makes sense because all of Naxxramas cards are basically Deathrattles, which is really cool. I'm glad they made a card that just kind of sums up the Deathrattle deck that people are going to be playing. And this will be a must-have in those decks for sure. It's just too situational to run this card in other decks. Yeah, summoning your minions back is great, but that's just a little too situational. It's too much mana, and the card itself isn't that great by itself. A 6/6 is not amazing by any means for 8 mana. Moving on to the class-specific cards that we're going to see. In Druid, we're going to see Poison Seeds, which is a 4 mana, destroy all minions and summon 2/2 Trents to replace them. I think this card's getting a little bit overrated right now. People love this card for some reason. I don't understand why. In a lot of scenarios, in control versus control matchups, if you're running this card, a lot of times it's just going to be a worse polymorph. Best case scenario is very situational and will likely require a very synergetic deck to run it in, such as a Druid Rush deck or a counter to Zoo. I think eventually we're not going to see this card played at all, or it's not going to be valued very highly in mid-range or control Druid deck. The rogue card is Anuber Ambusher, which is a 4 mana 5/5 with a Deathrattle of return a friendly minion to your hands. I absolutely love this card. I think it's one of the best cards that has been released in Naxx, and certainly among the class cards. It has better stats than a Yeti. I mean, that is amazing. And it has absolutely sick synergy with Rogue. Bouncing things back like Ringleader or SI7 Agent. That can be amazing. I think Blizzard put on that Deathrattle, or they definitely put on that Deathrattle because they wanted to have a drawback to having such a good quality minion stat. But the problem is they put it in the wrong deck because Rogue has so many cards that they don't mind bouncing back to their hand. I think you're really going to see mid-range Rogue decks become very popular because of this card. The Warrior class card is called Death's Bite, which is a 4 mana 4 attack, 2 durability with a Deathrattle of deal 1 damage to all minions. I think this is going to be one of the best weapons in the game. It's a card that synergizes really well in warrior decks with Execute, Armorsmith, Enraging Gromish. It's basically, in my mind, a better True Silver Champion because it does have that 4 attack, which is so important on turn 4 to have. It deals with a lot of minions that you wouldn't be able to deal with on your regular turn 4. And it has a Deathrattle that you can get amazing synergy with. The thing about this card is it may take a little while for people to play the card, understand when they want to use that Deathrattle and when not to. But once people get a grasp of how this card works, I think you're going to see amazing synergy with this card. It will be a top 2 weapon in the game. I'm calling it right now. The Paladin class card is called Avenge. It's a 1 mana secret. When one of your minions dies, give a random friendly minion +3/+2. I'm pretty sad about this card. It's not the fact it's a secret. I don't mind that it's a secret. That would be perfectly fine, especially considering that I think secret decks are going to be very viable. The fact that this card is so reliant on having a board with more than 1 minion, that's a very hard thing to do in Hearthstone. It's very situational, and it'll only be good in a situation where you have board control. You can't even play it on your own turn, so it's not like you can attack into a minion and know which one you're going to buff up. And even the buff, in my opinion, is not that great. Giving a minion 3/2, it really depends what you're giving it to, but let's say you're giving it to a recruit, that minion is still going to die to 2 drops. It's still going to die to 3 drops. I think it would be much better if you gave the minion +2/+3. I think health is much more viable when you're buffing up minions. The Mage class card is called Duplicate. It is a secret for 3 mana. When a friendly minion dies, put 2 copies of it in your hand. At first, I thought this card was going to be really bad, but then after giving it more thought, I actually think this is going to be a really good secret. This card is going to have some sick synergetic plays with Mage. It's going to be most likely played in mid-range tempo Mage deck that can get good use out of Deathrattle cards. The fact that Mage have so much removal, this card basically allows them to run even more removal. You may see Blizzards and Flame Strikes in the deck because now they can get a recopy of their minion and play more of those really efficient minions. The other thing about Mage secret decks is there's a ton of good secrets, so it's very hard for your opponent to play around and guess what kind of secrets you're going to run. I think this card is going to be played a lot, especially in arena and mid-range Mage. The next card we're looking at is the Warlock class card, which is called Voidcaller. It's a 4 mana 3/4. The Deathrattle is put a random demon from your hand into the battlefield. On the contrary to Duplicate, I thought this card was going to be sick at first, but then I started considering the fact that it's so reliant on you not only having this card in your hand, but another big demon in your hand to summon. If you're summoning something like a Voidwalker, that's going to be really bad, obviously. The Deathrattle relies on you having the perfect hand, and unfortunately that is not something that generally leads to success consistently. This is one of those cards that if it works out the way you want it to, it'll be amazing, it'll win you the game. If it doesn't, it's going to be pretty bad. And unfortunately, I think consistently it's not going to work very well. It has bad stats for a 4 job. That's really the biggest issue with it. 3-4 stat is not great. If it was something like a 5-3 or a 3-5, this card would be much more playable and it would be perfectly viable in most decks. In fact, it would be quite good. I actually think they should probably buff this card's stat a little bit. The Shaman class card that we're looking at now is Reincarnate, which is a 2 mana, destroy a minion, then return it to life with full health. It's an interesting card and it requires quite a bit of thinking of how can we get synergy out of this card. I think you're most likely to see this card in Deathrattle decks because you can of course kill your minion, get the Deathrattle, summon another copy of it, and then eventually get that Deathrattle too. You may also play this card against your opponent on a minion that is buffed up, and therefore you can kill it. It'll come back unbuffed, maybe even against cards like Dancing Sword so that you can draw yourself another card. But I think generally it's going to be played in most Deathrattle Shaman decks, which I think are going to be very strong, so this card will be a must-have in those decks. The Priest class card that we're looking at is called Dark Cultist, which is a 3 mana, 3-4, with a Deathrattle of give a random friendly minion plus 3 health. Everyone lost their mind when this card first came out and they thought it was going to be like the best thing ever. It was going to make Priest the most viable class and it will completely change the Priest class forever. I don't quite think that way. Don't get me wrong, I think this card is great, but that Deathrattle is very situational and most of the time you are not going to be hitting a minion with it. The main problem I have with this card is the fact that Priest already had some really solid 3-drop options like Injured Blade Master, Thought Steal. Even Harvest Golem may compete with this card. Of course, this card has great stats for a 3. The 3-4 is beautiful, and it may cause your opponent to act slightly different on their turn. They may not want to attack this minion. They may attack something else that you don't want them to. Overall, I think the card is really good, but I think that they could have benefited from a 2-drop much higher than this card. Maybe a 2-mana minion with a 2-4 stat line, which is slightly worse than the Dark Cultist, and maybe even the same battle cry or +2 to a friendly minion. It'll be good for sure, but it just won't be the end-all be-all of Priest. The next class card that we're looking at is Hunter, which is called Web Spinner. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with a Deathrattle of add a random beast card to your hand. That means a random beast card overall. That does not mean a random beast card in your deck. That means from all over the place. Any beast card, which means you could grab Timberwolf or you could grab King Crush. It's hard not to be harsh on this card, but I think it's probably the worst one out of the pack. It's either this one or the Paladin Secret. I think the fact that it's a 1/1 is going to be really bad for Hunter decks in this expansion because I think Hunter decks are going to be moving towards a more control style deck, which this card is completely random and it could be great, but most of the time it's not going to be very good. I think this is one of those cards that's going to be played a lot at first because it's really fun and the potential is high and who knows what you're going to get. It's kind of like mind games. Thankfully, it's for less mana, but again, it doesn't put it on the field, so it's not that great. It's just, I think decks are moving more towards a synergetic style, whereas this card is completely random. Perhaps you'll see it in Arena more than Constructed, though, because, again, people really like that fun style card, and that's exactly what this card is, but it's not something that Hunter needed, so I think it's a little unfortunate for the Hunter class. Alright guys, that is it. That is our review of the Naxxramas cards. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me and listening to that review. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of the cards, maybe different opinions that you have on the card. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, and thanks for watching guys. Have a good one.